Studious Antoinette Stevens secretly yearned for romance.
What she was really looking for was to feel loved.
When she met Harvard PhD candidate Kashif Parvez, her search was over.
She was pulled in by his charm and good looks.
But Kashif had a secret of his own.
He's living this double life.
Their mysterious romance ignited fireworks.
He's very handsome, looks physically fit.
But their passionate affair would be cut short when gunfire shatters the peace in a quiet community.
All of a sudden, these three men just jumped out from nowhere.
Plunging police into a desperate fight to solve a hate crime.
These people just screamed, "Kill the terrorists."
More hateful than anyone could imagine.
They just couldn't understand who would do something like this.
Witness firsthand how investigators unraveled a tangled web of scandal and lies.
The story just didn't feel right.
To expose a hidden evil that shocked a community and tore a family apart.
The things that we find completely reprehensible and disgusting, well, for them, it fits into their scheme.
August 16th, 2011, 11:15 p.m. Like any other night in Boonton, New Jersey, the streets were deserted.
It's a totally quiet place. People are going to sleep or watching 11 o'clock news.
But at the local emergency dispatch center, a barrage of calls sent operators scrambling. Every caller frantically described the same thing.
They received reports of 6 to 8 gunshots.
Officers rushed to the residential street where callers reported hearing the gunshots and came across a shocking scene.
There was a man lying there, and he had been shot more than once, and he looked like he was in really bad shape.
Despite multiple gunshot wounds, the man was somehow still alive. When he weakly pointed to a spot a few yards away, officers saw that he wasn't the only casualty.
Police saw a stroller and a woman collapse behind it, and they feared the worst.
Inside the stroller was a little boy, who investigators were relieved to find miraculously unharmed.
There was no other wounds or injuries to the child.
But the woman lying in the street next to the stroller hadn't been so lucky.
She was struck 3 times in the chest area.
She was shot dead.
While paramedics swarmed around the man, he identified himself as 26-year-old Kashif Parvez. The woman was his wife, 27-year-old Nazish, and the boy, their 3-year-old son. Kashif told police that he and his family were from Brooklyn and were in Boonton visiting his in-laws. They were out taking an evening stroll together when the unthinkable happened. They'd been ambushed.
3 masked men came out of nowhere and started shooting them.
Investigators were stunned.
Who would attack this young couple with their child in a stroller?
Police had no way of knowing that the search for an answer to that question would soon lead them to a sordid web of deceit, hate, revenge, and unbridled passion turned deadly. Born in 1984 in India, Antoinette Stevens moved to Massachusetts with her family when she was a toddler. From their first days in the U.S., Antoinette's mother and father had high expectations for their daughter.
Antoinette's parents were hard workers. They really wanted to be successful in America, and they wanted the same for their children.
With her mother and father's constant encouragement and their strict supervision, their bright young girl became an excellent student. By high school, the college-bound high achiever knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life.
Antoinette was quite driven, and she decided she wanted to be an architect, and her parents were thrilled with that choice.
But her parents weren't wealthy enough to pay Antoinette's way for a master's degree in architecture. By 2010, the now 25-year-old Antoinette was living at home and working 2 jobs in order to afford a full schedule of classes. But the pressure to achieve at school and pay her way through to graduation left little time for anything else.
Antoinette didn't have a lot of friends. Her family was the core of her social life.
Despite having grown into an attractive young woman, Antoinette was still shy and introverted. School and work had left little time for dating.
She really wanted to know what it's like to have a boyfriend, to know what that meant and to know what that felt like.
Then in January of 2010, a handsome young man introduced himself as a fellow architecture student named Kashif Parvez. Right away, Antoinette felt a powerful attraction to the 24-year-old.
She was pulled in by his charm and apparent good looks.
The two quickly discovered that they had a lot in common.
They had both grown up with strict immigrant parents. He was Muslim and she was Christian, but outside of that, they shared a lot of experiences.
Both came from families that held high expectations for them.
He had a lot of pressure on himself growing up to be a certain way.
And like Antoinette, Kashif was a budding architect. The two grew closer and closer each day.
That they started out being friends.
In 2010, after just a few months of knowing each other, Kashif and Antoinette went from confidants to lovers.
Her loneliness had finally been broken by Kashif, and she was so happy, she wanted to shout it to the world.
Antoinette did everything in her power to show Kashif just how much she cared.
She was really devoted to him.
Antoinette was just taken by him.
And Kashif was only too happy to accept her affection and even the gifts Antoinette bought him.
Miss Stevens was in love with him and would do anything for him.
Antoinette had never had a boyfriend before. Keeping Kashif happy became her obsession. Meeting him had been like an answered prayer, except for one thing. Kashif Parvez was married.
He had a wife and 2 children.
Born in the U.S. and raised in a family steeped in his parents' native Pakistani culture, Kashif Parvez's childhood straddled 2 worlds. From an early age, Kashif's good looks, intelligence, and charm earned him doting attention from relatives and neighbors alike. His parents not only saw a bright future ahead for their favorite son, they planned it out for him step by step.
This is what you're going to go to school for. This is what you're, going to have as your career.
Kashif's parents chose architecture for his career. But when it came to romance, Kashif remained very independently minded. So much so that he made it clear to his parents that there was one old world Pakistani custom he would absolutely not be following: arranged marriage.
He felt he needed to take a different direction.
But his parents needn't have worried. The woman he fell in love with was not only beautiful, but also a devout Muslim and Pakistani American just like them. Kashif and Nazish married in 2005, when he was 20 and she was 21. The newlyweds didn't waste any time starting a family.
Fairly soon into their marriage, she became pregnant, so she had her first son. And then a few years later, she had her second son.
Every morning, stay-at-home mom Nazish would watch her husband leave home with his laptop and armload of textbooks. At night, when he returned, Kashif would talk about his day, spent at the highly competitive Columbia University Architecture Master's Program. And then one evening, 24-year-old Kashif returned home from his classes with big news.
He told his wife that he was going to get his PhD at Harvard.
For their entire marriage, Kashif had balanced school with work at a small contracting business. Alone at home, Nazish grew to rely on her family in Boonton, New Jersey, and her in-laws in Brooklyn. Kashif decided to temporarily move to Boston by himself. Once he had his degree, they would figure out whether to move to Boston or keep the family in Brooklyn.
He understood it wouldn't be a very easy time for them, but that it was the best thing to do for his family.
But once he moved to Boston, the absence of his family began to gnaw at Kashif. Weekend trips home only made him feel dislocated. That all changed when a few months after arriving in Boston, Kashif met a shy and pretty young Indian immigrant named Antoinette Stevens. For Kashif, having someone he could talk to helped ease the pain of missing his family. But as Kashif and Antoinette's connection deepened, Kashif began to feel more emotionally removed from his absent wife and family. Weekends home with Nazish became less frequent, and when he did make the trip back to Brooklyn, all he and his wife did was fight.
It was not a happy marriage.
The frustrations Kashif felt with Nazish would be soothed when he returned to Boston, and Antoinette. But as Antoinette and Kashif's passion grew, so did Kashif's doubt. What did he and Antoinette have to look forward to in the years ahead? Divorce from Nazish and a marriage of their own? As a Muslim, leaving his wife would be a very difficult task.
Divorce is frowned upon, so I think he was worried about the repercussions to that.
And the prospect of bringing a woman who was both Indian and Christian home to meet his parents was almost more unthinkable.
It's certainly not something the Muslim religion would condone in the least bit.
In the meantime, Kashif and Antoinette spent long, blissful nights together. For Antoinette, Kashif was the center of her existence. Meanwhile, Nazish was back in Brooklyn, raising 2 sons by herself, entirely unaware that her husband was having an affair. Then, in the summer of 2011, after nearly 2 years of living apart, Nazish surprised Kashif with an unexpected demand. She told Kashif that there was only one way to save their troubled marriage. She and the boys, now 5 and 3, would now be with him.
She had been making arrangements to try to move to Boston. She was hopeful. She was hoping to go out there so they could be a family again.
She struggled to pick up the pieces of her life. Kashif prepared to welcome his wife and children back into his life. But their family reunion would be short-lived. Tragedy lay just ahead. Coming up, the search for a motive unearths violent bigotry.
They screamed, "Kill the terrorists."
This is a hate crime.
For 2 years, married 26-year-old Kashif Parvez and 26-year-old Antoinette Stephen carried on a passionate affair in Boston. But with Kashif's family about to move to Boston from their Brooklyn home to be with him, the guilt-ridden husband and father broke off his secret romance.
He had hoped to try as much as possible to work it out.
He did not want to lose the kids.
Though unaware of the affair, Kashif's wife Nazish had known that their marriage was in trouble.
She kind of said, "We need to be together as a family. We're moving in."
The months of work Nazish and Kashif had put into staying together seemed to be paying off. They looked forward to traveling as a family to celebrate the Ramadan holiday in her parents' hometown of Boonton, New Jersey. But on the night of August 16th, 2011, police in Boonton responded to a flurry of 911 calls.
The neighbors were reporting several gunshots.
And when they arrived on the scene, first responders found Kashif gunned down in the street and fighting for his life. His wife Nazish lay nearby, next to their 3-year-old son.
The wife had been shot directly through the heart.
Nazish was dead, but the couple's 3-year-old son was unharmed. In fact, his mother's lifeless body had prevented his stroller from rolling downhill to an almost certain death.
Even though she was murdered, she somehow was able to save her son's life.
As paramedics triaged Kashif's gunshot wounds and prepared to transport him, police questioned the still conscious survivor about the attack.
Kashif was in quite a bit of shock, but he was still able to talk to the authorities.
Kashif explained that his family was in Boonton, celebrating the end of the annual Muslim holiday fast of Ramadan with his wife's parents. As the evening came to an end, they decided to take their youngest son for a walk.
He and his wife were walking after dinner from her sister's house to her father's house, which is only a 2-block walk.
But suddenly, the evening took a turn for the terrified and tragic.
All of a sudden, these 3 men just jumped out from nowhere.
Kashif told police that before he even knew what was happening, he and his family were caught in a hail of bullets.
these three masked men had come out of the darkness and then just started shooting at them.
Detectives knew that the first few hours after a violent crime were critical to a successful investigation. They pressed Kashif for any details before he was placed in an ambulance and shepherded to the emergency room. Kashif told them that only 2 of the men had guns. Asked for a physical description, he mostly recalled the masks.
There was 2 black males and 1 white male. One of the black males being heavy set, and the white male wearing some sort of like either a t-shirt or a scarf over his face.
Anxious paramedics cut the interview short, and the ambulance raced off to the local trauma center. Now, police turned their full attention to the crime scene. Shell casings from 2 weapons appeared to confirm Kashif's story.
It was a .38 caliber type weapon and then a 9mm.
But if police hoped to find the killers, they needed witnesses. When detectives canvassed the area, it was the same story everywhere. Lots of people heard the shots, but no one saw the men who fired them.
Police had no eyewitnesses.
Then, investigators got a break from within their own ranks. A first responding officer realized he'd seen something odd while en route to the scene.
When the police were rushing to the scene, a car passed them.
It was a blue Toyota Camry with their headlights out. They thought that was suspicious.
Detectives agreed. They needed to identify the mysterious vehicle, and they knew just the place to start.
We had traffic cameras.
When investigators pulled the tape from a camera at the intersection closest to the crime scene, they hit the jackpot.
We went back and looked at our Main Street cameras and were able to identify that vehicle.
Not only did the tape yield a clear description of the vehicle, a close examination told them even more.
They were able to get the license plate off that car.
The plate was issued in Massachusetts and registered to a resident of a sleepy suburb of Boston. Before Boonton police could reach out to their Massachusetts counterparts, word arrived that Kashif was out of danger and able to be questioned further.
Police were hoping that once the initial shock had worn off, Kashif would remember more things about the attack.
As detectives took notes, Kashif again described the shocking crime that had shattered his family just hours before. Only the details had slightly changed.
It's very likely in that situation, if a person's been shot, that they could be woozy and not be getting their facts correct.
His story then changed to 3 black males.
And there was another detail he remembered since coming to the hospital. When he told police what the men had said during their attack, it shocked even seasoned homicide detectives.
The 3 black males yelled "terrorist" as they shot.
They screamed, "Kill the terrorists."
What had initially appeared to be a random violent crime wasn't random at all.
He is telling them this is a hate crime.
Coming up, were the hands on the triggers driven by hate or love?
There was obviously something going on with him and the other party.
And a shocking denial suggests that a jealous lover not only may have been involved, but may not have acted alone.
That kind of raises some red flags.
After nearly 2 years of secret meetings, straying husband Kashif Parvez had put his family first and ended his passionate affair with Antoinette Stephen. While their mutual attraction had proved irresistible, Kashif's traditional Muslim values ultimately won out.
The idea of divorce was something that he knew would be something that would bring shame on him.
But on August 16th, 2011, Kashif's marriage abruptly came to an end. Just after 11 p.m. in sleepy Boonton, New Jersey, a spray of bullets ripped through Kashif and his wife Nazish as they took an evening stroll with their 3-year-old son.
Just shot 3 times in the chest.
Ballistic evidence backed up Kashif's description of a group attack, and a surveillance camera showed a possible getaway vehicle registered in suburban Boston. But what police officers didn't have was a motive.
They just couldn't understand who would do something like this.
Then the widowed dad shared troubling new details with police.
They were yelling at them that they were terrorists before they shot them.
We don't have that kind of hate crime. Since I've been on 19 years, I've never had a bias crime such as that.
But experienced investigators still wondered if the deadly attack was more personal than political.
Maybe it's not a bias crime, but there's some reason.
Police asked the devout Muslim dad if he had been the recipient of threatening calls or texts. Kashif told investigators he had no idea who would want to hurt his family.
Bhutan is just a quiet suburban town, out of the way, and it's made no sense at all.
But when detectives asked to examine the grieving widower's cell phone for suspicious incoming calls, Kashif's reply caught them completely by surprise. He flatly refused.
That kind of right there raises some red flags. Your wife just got murdered. You just got shot. What's the deal with your cell phone?
Puzzled investigators filed the necessary paperwork to impound and examine Kashif's phone, whether he liked it or not. Finally, Kashif told them the truth.
He came out and said, "I have a girlfriend."
The ashamed husband and father admitted to police that text messages on his phone would reveal his secret, an on-campus love affair that he carried on with a beautiful co-ed named Antoinette Stephen hadn't ended. In fact, the two lovers were still seeing each other.
He definitely did not want to get his girlfriend mixed up in it.
When Kashif shared his full feelings about his marriage with police, they were surprised at how bitter the widowed husband was about his recently murdered wife.
The wife was shot around 11 p.m. By about 2 a.m., Kashif is already bad-mouthing the wife. He claimed that she was not a good mother, very greedy. One of his recurring themes was how materialistic his wife was.
She would purchase items for the home and for herself that she and Kashif could not afford.
Did this bitterly unhappy husband have something to do with his wife's death? Investigators put it directly to him.
And the detective confronted him and said that they felt that maybe there was more to his story. Maybe it didn't happen the way he had said.
Under an increasingly relentless interrogation, Kashif began to break down. After admitting his marriage was unhappy, he intimated that he also hadn't been entirely truthful about the night of the murder.
He just started spilling out more information.
And it wasn't long before the dam burst.
He was saying this was an accident, it was never meant to happen.
As stunned detectives listened, Kashif shared the details of a conspiracy gone wrong. It all started, he said, with a conversation between the unhappy husband and a mysterious man that Kashif told police was named Nomi To. Kashif said he barely knew Nomi To and was only able to sketch out the barest details to police.
He said there was someone named Nomi To from Queens who was a friend of his.
According to Kashif, Nomi was a truck driver who struck up a conversation with him one day at a diner in Brooklyn. Needing someone to confide in, Kashif had told the stranger about his ongoing affair and the obligation to Nazish that stood between him and happiness. Nomi told him that if he and his girlfriend wanted to be free, Nazish would have to be eliminated. Permanently.
He was talking about murder. He said that she needed to be taken out of the picture.
Nomi's plan was to ambush the couple, kill Nazish, and wound Kashif to throw police off the scent. Kashif told detectives that Nomi made murder sound like the only solution.
He made arrangements with this Nomi To to kill his wife.
Shooting Kashif too would be the icing on the cake. The cops would never suspect him after that.
But when detectives pressed Kashif on his co-conspirators' whereabouts, he told them he didn't even know the tow truck driving hitman's real name. The only clue he could offer was a vague one.
He was pointing them to Brooklyn. He told police Nomi To hangs out at a certain deli.
But where in Brooklyn? And what is Nomi To's real name? Finding Nomi To seemed like searching for a needle in a haystack.
There had to be some connection that would get them closer to Nomi To.
With little else to go on, investigators decided to speak to the victim's family. While Nazish's heartbroken loved ones knew nothing about Nomi To's murder conspiracy, they had plenty to share about Kashif.
I interviewed both the sister and the brother, and they didn't seem surprised at all that he would be involved in this.
Nazish's family told police that in the time Kashif had been a part of the family, they'd all noticed a disturbing tendency. Kashif tended to bend the truth.
He's apparently very persuasive. He was a liar.
But Nazish's siblings also told police one thing was true. Kashif was very unhappy in his marriage.
He was very verbally abusive to her. He was physically abusive.
Nazish said she even feared Kashif's abuse was escalating.
She sent text messages saying, he wants to kill me, and if you find me dead, it's Kashi's the one who did it.
Investigators dug deeper into Kashif's background and made a shocking discovery. While nothing in his past indicated he was a murderer, police were still stunned to learn that Kashif had something to hide. When it came to his education, Kashif Parvez wasn't a model student. He was a compulsive liar.
They had no record of him at Columbia or Harvard.
He claimed that he was enrolled in Harvard, attending Harvard, and that turned out to be complete fiction.
Was Nomi To as much a fantasy as Kashif's Ivy League resume? With the warrant for Kashif's phone now in hand, detectives hoped they were about to find out once and for all.
We went through with the communications data warrant for the information on his cell.
Police found plenty of steamy texts between Kashif and Antoinette. And as the message dates grew closer to the date of the murder, Kashif and Antoinette's exchanges took on a more sinister tone.
Where are you? Are you ready? That sort of thing.
She was saying freedom is just around your corner.
But investigators couldn't find any mention of Nomi To anywhere in Kashif's phone. Could Antoinette lead police to the triggerman? When investigators obtained Antoinette's phone records, they learned that Kashif's lover wasn't at home in Massachusetts on the night of the murder. She was in New Jersey.
She was shown as having been in Boonton during the time the crime was committed.
Antoinette had no reason to be nearly 250 miles away from home. And the car that surveillance footage put near the scene was registered in Massachusetts. Investigators began to wonder, just how active a role had Antoinette taken in Kashif and Nomi To's murder plot? In order to answer that question, they would need to head north to Massachusetts, impound Nomi To's getaway vehicle, and question Antoinette.
And that night, we headed up to Massachusetts.
When investigators pulled up to the address listed on the Camry's registration, they saw the car itself parked in the driveway. Was Nomi To waiting for them inside?
Police knocked on the door, and they realized immediately they had come to the right place.
Coming up, a killer's lies unravel.
So that was just a red herring, a story to throw off the police.
And police hear evidence of a master manipulator's deadly persuasion.
The things that we find completely reprehensible and disgusting, well, for them, it fits into their scheme.
Antoinette Stephen and her married lover, Kashif Parvez, were desperate to be together, but divorce was out of the question.
The idea of divorce was something that he knew would be something that would bring shame on him because of his culture.
But in August of 2011, it looked as if Till Death Do Us Part had arrived. Kashif and his wife Nazish were attacked, and a hail of bullets wounded Kashif and killed his wife. Kashif initially insisted to police that he had nothing to do with his wife's death. But under intense interrogation, he finally admitted that though he didn't pull the trigger, he was partially to blame.
He said he had hired someone named Nomi To to do the killing.
Text messages between Antoinette and Kashif and the license number of the blue Camry seen leaving the scene of the shooting led police to the front door of a home in suburban Boston. Now, they hope that Nomi To was only a knock away.
Once they were able to get the license, track the license plate of the car bunch of detectives made a trip up to the Boston area.
The police go to Massachusetts to find Nomito, find the car.
But when the door opened, the face that greeted them wasn't a mysterious tow truck driving hitman. It was 26-year-old Antoinette Stephen. Antoinette was shocked to see detectives standing on the doorstep.
When we made contact, she acted like she had no idea why we were there.
Antoinette explained that they had come to her parents' house and that the car parked in the driveway was her father's. She quickly agreed to accompany the investigators to a local police station.
She was fully cooperative.
Police questioned Antoinette about her relationship with Kashif. She readily admitted to their affair, but she said she hadn't heard from him.
She's asking police, how is he?
When police asked her about the plot to kill Nazish, Antoinette had no idea what they meant.
She denies any knowledge of what had occurred.
While Antoinette was interrogated, police searched for anything that might get them closer to the truth.
We executed a search warrant at her parents' house.
A look inside Antoinette's closet revealed a suitcase.
In that suitcase, it had clothes. In the middle of the clothes had a purple box.
When officers opened the box, they knew they had broken the case at last. The box held not one, but two guns.
A 9mm semi-automatic handgun and a .38 special.
Each gun chambered the same caliber of ammunition fired in the attack.
They match exactly the bullet casings they found at the scene of the crime.
Investigators now believed that Antoinette had come to Boonton on the night of Nazish's death to retrieve and hide the two murder weapons.
Perhaps Kashif made her an accomplice. Her job was to give out the guns.
Whatever the whole story was, hiding guns was enough for police to place Antoinette under arrest. She was charged with murder, conspiracy, and endangering the welfare of a child. Back in Boonton, they leveled the same charges against Kashif.
This was sadly the alleged handiwork of the victim's husband, who allegedly did the unthinkable, plotting the murder of his wife.
But Kashif's co-conspirator wasn't a mysterious truck driver turned hitman. Police were now utterly convinced that Antoinette Stephen had helped set up Nazish's murder, and that Nomito was just another strand in Kashif's web of lies and did not exist.
That was just a red herring, a story to throw off the police.
It was very possible that Kashif himself had shot his wife, and then to cover up for the situation, he shot himself in the foot and in the shoulder.
But when investigators unearthed surveillance footage from a gun range in Massachusetts, they realized they still didn't quite have the whole story. Video showed Kashif and Antoinette arriving at the gun range 2 weeks before the shooting. But as investigators watched, it became apparent that it wasn't Kashif who was honing his skills.
It was Antoinette just firing center mass at a target.
Not only was Antoinette doing the shooting, she was standing in a downrange position that exactly matched the bullet trajectories measured from the murder scene.
It looked like to be the 5-7 yard range, which is consistent to walking up to somebody and shooting them.
Police recognized the truth. What they were watching was a rehearsal for murder, with Antoinette cast as one of the shooters. Had Kashif used one of the guns to shoot his wife and then asked Antoinette to shoot him with the other, they wouldn't have to wait long for an answer. With evidence mounting, Antoinette agreed to tell the whole story.
Antoinette did crack under pressure and confessed to being involved with the crime.
Antoinette told detectives that she was involved, but that her conscience was clean. According to Kashif, they had every reason to kill his wife. Not only was Nazish standing between them and happiness, Kashif said that his wife wouldn't permit desperately needed medical care for their son.
Parvez told Antoinette that his little son had sickle cell anemia, and the wife refused to bring the boy for treatment.
Antoinette was wondering what kind of a mother would do something like this to their child.
At first, Antoinette gave Kashif everything she could spare from her tuition savings.
He needed money, and she ended up giving him money to help fund this child's medical condition.
And when Kashif came to her with his plan to get rid of Nazish once and for all, Antoinette was willing to do anything to see Kashif happy at last.
He had this terrible marriage from which he needed to free himself.
Antoinette believed that with Nazish out of the picture, she and Kashif could finally be together.
She was really under this perception that they were going to live happily ever after as a family.
All it would take was to set Kashif's plan into motion. On the night of August 16th, Antoinette told police she waited in a driveway on the Boonton Street where Kashif had told her he and his wife would be walking. But when she spotted the couple just after 11 p.m., she also saw something that hadn't been a part of their strategy.
In the original plot, the little boy wasn't supposed to be there.
Antoinette knew that they might never get another chance. In spite of the boy being with them, she made the next move.
She stepped out of the darkness, of the shadows, into the street. She had 2 handguns with her to make it appear to be more than one shooter. She fired.
Antoinette's first shots ripped through Nazish.
Antoinette shoots her 3 times.
Once her rival lay lifeless, just as they planned, she turned the second gun on her lover.
Antoinette was the one who had shot his wife and then shot him.
Antoinette admitted that immediately after she stopped shooting, she then got into her blue Camry and drove home to hide the guns police found in her closet.
The things that we find completely reprehensible and disgusting, well, for them, it fits into their scheme.
In order to confirm Antoinette's confession, police made inquiries about the things Kashif had told her. A phone call confirmed his son's critical health crisis was another lie.
The little boy had nothing wrong with him.
By all accounts, Nazish was a model mother. The entire deadly conspiracy had hinged on Kashif's power to persuade Antoinette to do his bidding. No questions asked.
He was manipulating the whole time. There was not one time, though, I think he was probably really honest with her.
But as investigators prepared to seek justice in court for Nazish, they got word that even with Antoinette's confession on the books and Kashif in jail awaiting his day in court, the killing might not be over. Coming up, on the eve of the murder trial, police uncover a deadly new plot.
He was attempting to find a hitman.
And shocking new evidence leads to an even more bizarre conspiracy.
To put a spell on her so she commits suicide.
When Antoinette Stephen met married Kashif Pervez, their love affair generated passion, deception, and murder. A brutal shooting left Kashif's wife Nazish dead and Kashif wounded. And police now had Antoinette and Kashif in custody for his wife's murder.
She and Kashif together had planned the murder.
And Antoinette did the shooting.
Antoinette was the one who had shot his wife and then shot him.
But during the run of the trial, prosecutors and police received word that Kashif was still in the market for an assassin.
Corrections officers opened his mail and they found that he was attempting to find a hitman.
Not content with ending his wife's life, Kashif was looking to extend the death toll to include multiple members of Nazish's family.
To have this person kill anyone in her family that would be able to take custody of the children.
Intercepted letters revealed that Kashif had even bigger plans beyond contract murder. After making bail, he intended to kidnap his children and flee with them to Pakistan.
He wanted his kids back, and he wanted his freedom back, and he thought this was the way to do it.
But no one expected the accused wife murderer to receive bail. And once the letters came to light, posting bond was completely out of the question.
His bail was 1.5 or 2.5 million.
In February of 2015, Kashif's day in court finally arrived.
We felt confident, but you can never tell. Nothing's 100%.
The courtroom fell into stunned silence when prosecutors presented new evidence.
As early as 2009, he was writing emails to black magic companies asking if they could make his wife disappear.
The jury could scarcely believe their ears. Prosecutors claimed that Kashif had reached out to websites that promised to cast voodoo spells for money.
He wanted to either have her poisoned or killed or just put a spell on her so she commits suicide.
Prosecutors put receipts totaling thousands of dollars that Kashif paid out to voodoo websites into evidence.
He asked one of the voodoo places, "How can I get my wife to commit suicide?"
But when it came time for the defense to state their case, they maintained that Nazish's death was a crime of passion committed by a jealous lover. Kashif's defense argued that Antoinette had acted on her own.
The defense strategy revolved totally around Antoinette Stephen being the killer.
I might be a jerk, I might be an awful guy, but I did not pull that trigger.
The jury wasn't buying it. On February 26, 2015, Kashif Parvez was found guilty of multiple charges, ranging from murder to child endangerment, and was sentenced to life in prison.
The verdict was very unanimous. He was guilty on all counts.
Having already pled guilty, Antoinette sidestepped a trial of her own.
Antoinette admitted that she was guilty and was sentenced to 30 years in prison.
But even with every lie now exposed, questions remained about Kashif Parvez.
How do you explain the logic in something like this? Who kills their wife in front of their baby?
And at what point does a love used to justify murder become sheer madness?
She was just so driven or so in love with him, she put blinders on, she killed somebody.
He's a master manipulator. He was easily able to take advantage of her.
There are cases that remain in the public memory because of the brutality of the crime. There are others that remain because of the identity of the victim, or because the circumstances seem almost impossible to comprehend. And then there are cases that remain because of a single question that can never truly be answered. The disappearance of 12-year-old Polly Klaas belongs to that last category. On the night of October 1st, 1993, Polly was taken from her own home in Petaluma, California. Her disappearance would trigger a massive search involving police officers, the FBI, volunteers, and people from communities far beyond her neighborhood. It would eventually lead investigators to Richard Allen Davis, a man with a serious criminal history who had been released from prison only a few months earlier. But before investigators knew his name, before they knew what had happened to Polly, and before the evidence would finally establish his connection to the crime, there was a moment that would haunt the case for years. Davis was encountered by police shortly after the kidnapping. His vehicle had become stuck on a private road in a rural area roughly 20 miles from Petaluma. Two Sonoma County Sheriff's deputies arrived to investigate. They questioned him. They examined his vehicle. They found no legal basis to hold him. And according to the account provided in the case record, they helped get his vehicle free before allowing him to leave. The deputies did not know that a 12-year-old girl had just been kidnapped. They did not know that the man standing in front of them was connected to the disappearance. They did not know that the vehicle they were examining would later become an important part of the investigation. Most importantly, they did not know that Polly Klaas was somewhere nearby. That encounter would become one of the most disturbing details in the entire case. It is tempting, when looking back at an investigation decades later, to imagine that the answer should have been obvious. But investigations do not happen with the knowledge of hindsight. The deputies did not possess the information that later investigators would have. They were responding to a man whose vehicle was stuck, not to a kidnapping suspect whose identity had already been established. The significance of that moment only became clear later. And according to Davis's own subsequent account, Polly was still alive at the time. That statement must be treated for what it was, a claim contained in his later confession. rather than something that can be independently reconstructed in every detail. Yet even with that qualification, the possibility is profoundly disturbing, because the story of Polly Klaas does not begin with a notorious criminal. It begins with a 12-year-old girl spending an ordinary evening at home. Polly Hannah Klaas lived in Petaluma with her mother, Eve Nichols, and her younger sister. On October 1st, 1993, Polly was having a sleepover with two female friends. The three girls were together in Polly's bedroom. Her mother and younger sister were in another part of the house. It was a familiar domestic setting, the kind of environment in which a child should have been able to feel secure. Nothing about the evening suggested that it would become the beginning of a case that would capture national attention. But around 10 o'clock that night, a stranger entered the home. His name was Richard Allen Davis. Davis was 39 years old. He also had something in his past that would later become critically important: a history of criminal convictions, including kidnapping and violent offenses. He had been released from prison only months earlier. When Davis entered the house, he carried a knife. He confronted the three girls and restrained them. According to the supplied case information, he threatened them and ordered them not to resist. The details are frightening precisely because of how quickly an ordinary home could be transformed into a place of fear. Three girls were suddenly confronted by an adult stranger who had entered their bedroom. Their safety depended upon their ability to survive a situation they could not possibly have anticipated. Davis eventually took Polly from the house. He left with her in a white Ford Pinto. At that moment, Polly's mother was still nearby, unaware of what was happening. The two other girls were eventually able to raise the alarm. The kidnapping was discovered, and Eve Nichols contacted the police. From there, the case changed immediately. A missing child was no longer simply a private family emergency. It became a large-scale search. Police began looking for Polly. The FBI became involved. Volunteers and members of the public joined the effort. Her photograph began appearing in news reports, transforming the missing child from a name known to her family and friends into a face recognized across the country. But at the beginning of that search, investigators faced a fundamental problem. They did not know who had taken her. They had a child who had vanished from her own bedroom, a group of witnesses who had experienced the kidnapping, and a desperate need to find her before it was too late. They did not yet know that Richard Allen Davis was the person responsible. They did not know that his white Ford Pinto had already carried Polly away from Petaluma. And they did not know that, only a short time later, officers would encounter him in a rural area. Davis had driven away from Petaluma and eventually reached a private road where his vehicle became stuck. A landowner noticed him and contacted authorities. When two Sonoma County Sheriff's deputies arrived, Davis attracted enough suspicion to be questioned. His circumstances were unusual. His vehicle was stuck. He was in an area where the landowner had apparently considered his presence suspicious enough to contact law enforcement. The deputies investigated, but there was one critical piece of information missing from their understanding of the situation: the kidnapping of Polly Klaas. The information had not reached them in time. Without that knowledge, the deputies had no reason to understand that the man before them could be connected to a child who had just disappeared. They checked the situation, found no legal basis to hold Davis, and eventually helped free his vehicle. Then he was allowed to leave. The significance of that decision would only emerge much later. According to Davis's subsequent account, he had hidden Polly in a wooded area near where his vehicle had become stuck. He later claimed that when the deputies left, he returned for her and continued driving north. Again, this is important to distinguish between what was established by the investigation and what came from Davis himself. His account became part of the evidence surrounding the case, but the precise circumstances of Polly's condition during that period cannot simply be reconstructed as unquestionable fact from his statement alone. What can be said is that the encounter became one of the most haunting moments associated with the investigation. A suspect had crossed paths with law enforcement, The officers did not know who he was in relation to the kidnapping. They released him. The search for Polly continued. And somewhere beyond the immediate reach of the investigators, the man who had taken her remained free. In the days that followed, the case would grow larger, more desperate, and more complicated. Investigators would search rural areas and roads. Volunteers would join the effort. Polly's family would continue waiting for information that might tell them whether she was alive. Meanwhile, Richard Allen Davis would remain outside the center of the investigation, at least for the moment. The case had not yet reached the point where his name would become inseparable from Polly's. That would come later, when investigators began examining evidence left behind near the place where his vehicle had been stuck. For now, however, the search remained a race against uncertainty. A 12-year-old girl was missing. Her family did not know where she was. Investigators did not know who had taken her. And one of the men who would eventually become the central figure in the case had already been encountered by police and allowed to drive away. The question that would remain long after the investigation ended was not simply how Polly had disappeared. It was what might have happened if the right information had reached the right officers at the right moment. There is no certain answer. There never can be. But that unanswered question would become one of the defining shadows of the Polly Klaas case. The night Polly Klaas disappeared did not end when Richard Allen Davis drove away from the rural road. For the people searching for her, that night was only the beginning. What they knew was painfully limited. A 12-year-old girl had been taken from her own home in Petaluma, California. Her two friends had survived the encounter and raised the alarm. Her mother, Eve Nichols, had called the police. Authorities were now searching for Polly, but the person responsible had not yet been identified. There was no clear name to place at the center of the investigation. No established motive that could explain why Polly had been chosen, and no certainty about where she had been taken. The first hours after a disappearance are defined by uncertainty. Every possibility has to be considered because investigators do not yet know which details will become important and which will eventually prove irrelevant. In Polly's case, that uncertainty was made even more painful by the fact that the person responsible had already been encountered by law enforcement. But the deputies who encountered Davis did not know that. They did not know about the kidnapping when they arrived at the private road. They did not know that the white Ford Pinto in front of them was connected to the disappearance. They did not know that Polly might be somewhere nearby. From their perspective, they were dealing with a suspicious man whose vehicle had become stuck. Once they determined that they had no legal basis to keep him, they allowed him to leave. The investigation therefore continued without the information that, in hindsight, might have changed everything. For Polly's family, however, there was no hindsight. There was only the waiting. The search quickly expanded beyond the immediate surroundings of the house. Police became involved, the FBI joined the investigation, and volunteers and members of the public began looking for the missing girl. Polly's photograph circulated through news reports, allowing people who had never met her to recognize her face. The case had become a public emergency, but publicity could not answer the most basic questions. Where was Polly? Was she alive? Who had taken her? And why had she been targeted? The available information pointed investigators toward the events inside the house, but the identity of the offender remained unknown. The two girls who had been with Polly could provide information about what happened, but they could not provide the investigators with the name of the man who had taken their friend. Davis, meanwhile, had disappeared from the immediate attention of the investigation. He had left the rural area after the deputies helped free his vehicle. According to his later account, he returned to the location where he had hidden Polly and took her with him. He then continued north. That account would become significant only after Davis was identified as the suspect. At this stage, investigators did not yet have the benefit of his confession. They had to work with the evidence available to them and reconstruct a disappearance that had occurred in a matter of minutes. The search would continue for weeks. For Polly's family, those weeks represented an unbearable kind of uncertainty. A missing child creates a painful distinction between hope and knowledge. As long as there is no confirmation of death, the possibility of survival remains. But that possibility is accompanied by the fear of what might be happening beyond the family's sight. The search for Polly therefore continued not simply as an effort to solve a crime, but as an effort to find a child whose whereabouts were unknown. Police and volunteers examined areas around Petaluma and surrounding rural locations. The landscape itself became part of the investigation. Roads, wooded areas, and isolated places had to be considered because investigators did not know where the offender might have taken Polly. Every piece of information had to be assessed. Every possible sighting could potentially change the direction of the search. And yet, as the days passed, Polly remained missing. Davis also remained outside the investigation for a time. His criminal past would eventually become one of the most important parts of understanding how he came to be a suspect. But his history did not immediately lead investigators to him. He had been convicted of serious offenses before Polly disappeared, including kidnapping and other violent crimes. One previous case involved the kidnapping of a woman near a BART station in Hayward. Another, in San Mateo County in 1985, resulted in a 16-year sentence after a kidnapping in which the victim was forced to withdraw money from a bank. Davis had later been released on parole in 1993, approximately 3 months before Polly was taken. These facts would later become central to the public discussion surrounding the case, especially the question of how someone with a significant criminal history had been released and was able to commit another serious crime. But at the beginning of October 1993, those facts did not immediately provide investigators with the answer they needed. Davis was not yet the focus of the Polly Klaas investigation. The investigation remained open, and the search continued. There was also another encounter with police involving Davis during October, but he was still not immediately connected to Polly's disappearance. That detail became another part of the larger picture only after investigators eventually began to look closely at him. The case had not yet reached the breakthrough that would transform suspicion into evidence. For almost 2 months, Polly's family and the wider community were left without a definitive answer. The search became a test of persistence. People continued looking even as time passed. Investigators continued examining leads even though the central question remained unresolved. Then, near the end of November, the investigation began to change direction. On November 28, 1993, a landowner returned to the area where Davis's vehicle had previously been discovered stuck. There, a sweatshirt was found. Inside it were items that drew the attention of investigators, including tape. The discovery caused authorities to reconsider the circumstances surrounding Davis's presence in that area. The location was no longer simply the place where a suspicious stranger had needed help with a vehicle. It was potentially connected to the disappearance of Polly Klaas. Investigators began examining Davis more closely. His criminal history gave them additional reason to take his presence seriously. The pieces of information that had previously existed separately began to move toward one another. There was the kidnapping in Petaluma. There was the white Ford Pinto. There was the rural location where the vehicle had become stuck. There was Davis's unexplained presence there. There was the sweatshirt and the tape. And there was Davis himself, a man with a history that included previous kidnappings and violent offenses. On November 30th, investigators arrested Richard Allen Davis near Coyote Valley Indian Rancheria, close to Ukiah. At first, Davis denied involvement in Polly's disappearance. His arrest did not immediately provide investigators with every answer they were seeking. But now they had something they had not possessed at the beginning of the case: a specific suspect whose movements, history, and physical presence could be examined against the evidence. The investigation was entering a new phase. Instead of asking only where Polly might be, investigators could now ask whether Davis had been inside her home, whether he had taken her, and what evidence could establish the connection. One of the most important answers would come from Polly's bedroom. Investigators had examined the scene of the kidnapping and found a palm print. On December 2nd, the print was identified as belonging to Richard Allen Davis. The significance of that discovery was enormous. It placed Davis inside the room where Polly had been taken. His earlier presence near the rural road could no longer be viewed in isolation. The physical evidence connected him directly to the scene of the kidnapping. The investigation now had a chain beginning to form. Davis had been in the area immediately after the disappearance. His vehicle had been there. Physical evidence had been recovered near that location. His criminal history was known, and now his palm print had been found inside Polly's bedroom. The case had moved from uncertainty toward proof. Yet investigators still needed to know what had happened to Polly after she was taken. They needed to find her. They needed to understand the sequence of events after the kidnapping. And they needed to know whether Davis would tell them anything. 2 days after the palm print identification, on December 4th, Davis asked to speak with investigators. According to the case record, he told them, "I fucked up big time." He then admitted that Polly was dead and agreed to lead investigators to the place where her body had been left. After weeks of searching, the investigation had reached its most painful moment. Davis's information directed investigators toward an area near Cloverdale, outside Petaluma, along the US 101 area. There, Polly was found in brush. The search that had begun with the hope of finding a missing 12-year-old girl ended with the confirmation that she had been killed. The discovery answered the question of where Polly was, but it also closed the door on the possibility that her family had been holding on to for nearly 2 months. Polly was dead. Davis was now no longer simply a person of interest or a suspicious man encountered on a rural road. He was the person investigators had arrested, the man whose palm print had been found in Polly's bedroom, and the man who had led them to her remains. Yet the case was not finished. The investigation had established a connection between Davis and Polly, but the full circumstances of the crime would still have to be examined. Investigators would have to determine what happened between the moment Polly was taken from her bedroom and the moment her body was found. Prosecutors would eventually have to present the evidence in court, and Davis's own account of what happened would become part of the legal battle over his guilt, his motives, and the punishment he deserved. The search for Polly had ended, but the process of determining responsibility was only beginning. The discovery of Polly Klaas brought an end to one part of the investigation, but it opened another. For nearly 2 months, the central question had been where Polly was. Now investigators knew the answer, and it was the answer everyone had feared. Polly had been found dead in brush near Cloverdale, outside Petaluma, along the US 101 area. Richard Allen Davis had led investigators to the location after first denying involvement in her disappearance, and then asking to speak with investigators on December 4th, 1993. According to the case record, Davis told them, "I fucked up big time." He then acknowledged that Polly was dead and agreed to show investigators where her body had been left. The words were brief, but they marked the moment when the investigation changed from a search for a missing child into a homicide investigation. Investigators now had to reconstruct what had happened after Polly was taken from her bedroom. They had to examine Davis's account, compare it with the physical evidence, and determine what could be established beyond his own statements. That distinction was important. A confession can provide information, but a criminal investigation cannot simply depend on the words of the person accused. The investigators also had the physical evidence connecting Davis to the crime. His palm print had been found in Polly's bedroom, and on December 2nd, it was identified as belonging to him. That evidence placed him inside the room where the kidnapping had occurred. It was not merely evidence that he had been somewhere in the surrounding area. It connected him directly to the scene. The circumstances surrounding his vehicle provided another important piece of the picture. On the night Polly disappeared, Davis had driven away from Petaluma in a white Ford Pinto. His vehicle later became stuck on a private road roughly 20 miles from Petaluma. A landowner called authorities, and 2 Sonoma County Sheriff's deputies came to investigate. They questioned Davis, examined his vehicle, found no legal basis to keep him, and helped him get the vehicle free. At the time, they did not know about Polly's kidnapping. They did not know that Davis was connected to it. They did not know that Polly might have been nearby. The significance of that encounter became clearer only after Davis was identified as the suspect. According to his later account, he had hidden Polly in a wooded area near the location where his vehicle became stuck. He claimed that Polly was still alive when the deputies encountered him and that he returned for her after they left. Because this information came from Davis's later confession, it has to be treated carefully. It provides his account of what happened, but it does not give investigators an independent window into every moment of Polly's final hours. Still, the possibility described by Davis made the earlier police encounter especially disturbing. The deputies had unknowingly crossed paths with the man responsible for the kidnapping. They had even assisted him in getting his vehicle back onto the road. Then they watched him leave. There is no way to know what would have happened if they had known about the kidnapping. There is no way to establish with certainty whether Polly could have been rescued at that moment. But the encounter became an enduring part of the case because of the possibility that the investigation might have taken a completely different direction if the information had reached them sooner. The investigation also had to confront another question. Why had Davis been capable of committing such a crime in the first place? His history provided an unsettling answer, although it did not by itself explain every detail of what happened to Polly. Davis had a long criminal record. His convictions included theft, kidnapping, and violent offenses. One earlier case involved the kidnapping of a woman near a BART station in Hayward. In another kidnapping case in San Mateo County in 1985, he forced a victim to withdraw money from a bank. He received a 16-year sentence for that offense and was eventually released on parole in 1993. The timing was significant. Davis had been released only about 3 months before Polly disappeared. His history would later become central to the public debate surrounding the case. It raised difficult questions about parole, repeat offenders, and the ability of the criminal justice system to prevent someone with a serious history of violence from committing another crime. But the prosecution of Davis would ultimately have to focus on the specific evidence surrounding Polly. A prior criminal record could establish history, but it could not substitute for proof of what happened on October 1, 1993. Investigators, therefore, had to build the case around the kidnapping itself. According to the supplied case information, Davis entered the Kloss home carrying a knife. He confronted Polly and her 2 friends in the bedroom, restrained them, and threatened them. He then took Polly from the house. These details established the beginning of the crime. The later evidence connected Davis to the location. His palm print was found in Polly's bedroom. His vehicle had been encountered in the area shortly after the kidnapping. Evidence discovered near the place where his vehicle had become stuck caused investigators to reconsider his presence there. His criminal history gave investigators additional context. And finally, Davis himself provided information about Polly's death and directed police to her body. Taken together, these elements created a case that would eventually be presented before a jury. But the prosecution still had to establish more than the fact that Davis had been responsible for Polly's disappearance. The circumstances of her death mattered. According to the account Davis later gave, he moved Polly from the place where he had initially hidden her and drove north. He claimed that he eventually strangled her because he was afraid that the kidnapping would send him back to prison. He also said that he had been under the influence of alcohol and drugs. These statements became part of the evidence surrounding the case, but they did not automatically determine how the law would characterize his actions. Prosecutors argued that the crime was not simply an unpredictable act that had happened without preparation. Evidence presented later suggested that Davis had brought materials used to restrain the girls. That evidence became important to the prosecution's argument concerning the nature of the kidnapping and the level of planning involved. The distinction between an impulsive act and a crime involving preparation would matter greatly once the case reached trial. The defense would also have to decide how to respond to the evidence. Davis's lawyers did not completely deny that he had killed Polly. Instead, their strategy focused on challenging particular allegations, especially the accusation that the crime involved a sexual motive. That distinction became an important part of the courtroom proceedings. The prosecution had to prove the charges it had brought. The defense did not necessarily need to deny every fact surrounding Polly's death in order to challenge the state's interpretation of the crime. Meanwhile, the public had already formed a powerful reaction. Polly was 12 years old. Her disappearance had affected not only her family, but also the Petaluma community and people across the country who had followed the search. Her photograph had circulated widely. Volunteers had spent weeks looking for her. The discovery of her body transformed the public understanding of the case. The story was no longer about a missing child who might still return home. It was about a child who had been taken from her bedroom and killed. For the investigators, however, emotion could not replace evidence. They had to document what they knew, establish how they knew it, and separate confirmed facts from statements made by the suspect. The palm print was particularly important because it provided physical evidence that did not depend solely on Davis's willingness to cooperate. The location where Polly was found was important because Davis had directed investigators there. His statements provided additional information about the sequence of events. His prior history helped explain why investigators had taken his identity seriously once he became a suspect. But each piece had to fit into a coherent account of the crime. By the end of 1993, the basic outline had become clear. On October 1st, Polly had been taken from her home. Davis had left the area with her. He had been encountered by police but released because they did not know about the kidnapping. Weeks later, investigators began focusing on him. He was arrested on November 30th. His palm print was identified on December 2nd. On December 4th, he acknowledged that Polly was dead and led investigators to her remains. The next stage would move the case from investigation to prosecution. In 1996, Richard Allen Davis would face trial for the crimes surrounding Polly's disappearance and death. The evidence gathered over those years would be presented in court, where a jury would have to decide whether the prosecution had proved its case. And at the center of that courtroom battle would remain a fact that no argument could change. Polly Klaas had been 12 years old when she was taken from her home, and the investigation that followed would ultimately become one of the most consequential criminal cases in California during the 1990s. By the time Richard Allen Davis stood accused in the murder of Polly Klaas, the case had already moved through several distinct stages. It had begun with an ordinary night in a Petaluma home, transformed into a desperate search for a missing 12-year-old girl, and then become a homicide investigation after Davis led investigators to Polly's remains. But finding the person responsible was not the same as proving every element of the crime in court. The evidence had to be examined, challenged, and presented before a jury. The prosecution had to establish what Davis had done, while the defense had to determine which parts of the state's case could be challenged. In 1996, nearly 3 years after Polly disappeared, the case finally reached trial. The courtroom would become the place where the events of October 1st, 1993, were reconstructed through evidence, testimony, and Davis's own statements. The prosecution's case centered on a sequence that began inside Polly's bedroom. On that night, Davis entered the Klaas home carrying a knife. Polly and her 2 friends were in the bedroom. According to the supplied case information, Davis restrained the girls and threatened them before taking Polly from the house. The prosecution would use this sequence to establish that the kidnapping was deliberate and that Davis was responsible for removing Polly from the home against her will. One of the most significant pieces of evidence was the palm print discovered in Polly's bedroom. Investigators had found the print during their examination of the scene, and on December 2nd, 1993, it was identified as belonging to Davis. This evidence was important because it connected Davis directly to the place where the kidnapping occurred. His connection to the rural area where his vehicle had become stuck might have been suspicious by itself. But the palm print provided a physical link between Davis and Polly's home. The prosecution could therefore place Davis at the scene without depending entirely on his later confession. The circumstances surrounding his vehicle also became part of the larger narrative. After leaving Petaluma with Polly, Davis had driven the white Ford Pinto to a rural area. The vehicle became stuck on a private road, and a landowner contacted police. 2 Sonoma County Sheriff's deputies arrived. They questioned Davis, examined his vehicle, and ultimately allowed him to leave after finding no legal basis to hold him. The deputies did not know that a child had just been kidnapped. They did not know that the man they were speaking to was the suspect in that kidnapping. They even helped get his vehicle free. The prosecution could therefore present a disturbing sequence of events. Davis was encountered by law enforcement shortly after the crime. Yet the encounter did not result in his arrest because the relevant information had not reached those officers. The case would always carry the shadow of that missed connection. Yet the trial itself was not about what might have happened. It was about what could be proved. Davis's own statements also became important. After his arrest on November 30th, he initially denied involvement in Polly's disappearance. But on December 4th, he asked to speak with investigators. According to the case record, he said, "I fucked up big time." He then acknowledged that Polly was dead and agreed to lead investigators to her body. His cooperation provided information that brought the search to its final location near Cloverdale, outside Petaluma, along the US 101 area. The discovery of Polly's remains confirmed the worst fears of her family and the community. It also created a critical evidentiary connection between Davis and the death. Still, the precise circumstances of Polly's final hours had to be examined carefully. Davis claimed that after the deputies left the area where his vehicle had become stuck, he returned for Polly and continued driving north. He later said that he strangled her because he was afraid of returning to prison. He also claimed that he had been affected by alcohol and drugs. These statements became part of the case, but they were Davis's account. They were not simply accepted as an objective record of every event. Prosecutors had to establish the legal character of the crime through evidence. According to the supplied material, the prosecution argued that the crime involved preparation rather than being an entirely spontaneous act. Evidence indicated that Davis had brought materials used to restrain the girls. That evidence was significant because it suggested that the confrontation inside the Kloss home had involved some degree of preparation. The prosecution's interpretation therefore differed from any attempt to portray the kidnapping as a sudden event that had developed without planning. The defense faced a difficult position. Davis's lawyers did not completely deny that he had killed Polly. Instead, they focused on challenging particular accusations, especially allegations concerning a sexual motive. This meant that the courtroom dispute was not simply a question of whether Davis had been responsible for Polly's death. The legal arguments also concerned the precise nature of the crimes and the evidence supporting each charge. The charges included first-degree murder, kidnapping, burglary, robbery, and a sexual offense involving a child. Each allegation carried its own legal significance, and the prosecution had to establish the elements required for conviction. The jury, therefore, had to consider the evidence presented over the course of the trial and determine whether Davis was guilty. Outside the courtroom, however, the case had already taken on a significance that extended beyond the question of one defendant's guilt. Polly's age was central to the public response. She had been 12 years old. She had been taken from her own bedroom during a sleepover with friends. Her disappearance had triggered a massive search involving law enforcement and volunteers. Her photograph had been circulated widely while her family waited for answers. When her body was found, the case became a symbol of the vulnerability of children and the fear that can follow when a child disappears from a supposedly safe environment. Davis's criminal history also became an increasingly important part of the public discussion. He had a record that included kidnapping and violent offenses. He had been convicted in a San Mateo County kidnapping in 1985 and received a 16-year sentence. He had also been involved in an earlier kidnapping of a woman near Bard and Hayward. His release on parole in 1993, only approximately 3 months before Polly's disappearance, became a central point of debate. The question was larger than Richard Allen Davis himself. It concerned the ability of the criminal justice system to manage people with serious criminal histories after their release. The Polly Klaas case became part of a broader political conversation in California about repeat offenders and punishment. But during the trial, the jury's task remained specific. They were not being asked to solve California's parole system. They were being asked to determine what Richard Allen Davis had done to Polly Klaas and whether the evidence established his guilt under the law. The prosecution had a combination of physical evidence, witness information, Davis's connection to the scene, his movements after the kidnapping, his criminal history, and his eventual statements leading investigators to Polly's body. The defense sought to challenge aspects of the state's interpretation of those facts. At the heart of the case remained the palm print in Polly's bedroom. It was a physical link that tied Davis to the place where the crime began. His later confession provided another link, particularly because he knew where Polly's body had been left and led investigators there. His own account of the killing provided additional evidence concerning the circumstances of Polly's death. Yet the courtroom was also a place where the limits of knowledge mattered. The exact details of everything that happened after Davis left the Klaas home could not simply be reconstructed from assumption. Investigators had to distinguish between physical evidence, witness accounts, and Davis's statements. That distinction is essential in any criminal trial, particularly one as emotionally charged as the murder of a child. The evidence had to speak for itself. On June 18, 1996, after hearing the case, the jury found Richard Allen Davis guilty. The verdict established his criminal responsibility for Polly's murder and the related offenses brought before the court. But the proceedings were not over. A conviction answered the question of guilt. The next question was punishment. For Polly's family, the verdict could never restore what had been taken from them. For the court, however, another decision remained. What sentence should Richard Allen Davis receive for the kidnapping and murder of a 12-year-old girl? The answer would come later that year, when the case entered its final and most consequential phase. On September 26, 1996, Judge Thomas Hastings formally sentenced Davis to death. The punishment reflected the jury's decision during the penalty phase and brought the trial to its formal conclusion. But even after the sentence was imposed, the case would continue to influence California far beyond the courtroom. The death of Polly Klaas had already become part of the public debate over repeat offenders, parole, and punishment. The state had passed its 3 strikes legislation in 1994, and the case became closely associated with the political movement for harsher penalties for repeat serious offenders. Polly's name would therefore become connected not only to a tragic kidnapping and murder, but also to a major transformation in California's approach to criminal sentencing. Yet beneath the legal arguments, political debate, and notoriety surrounding Richard Allen Davis, there remained the same basic truth with which the case had begun. Polly Klaas was 12 years old when she was taken from her home. Her disappearance devastated her family and mobilized an enormous search. The investigation eventually uncovered the evidence necessary to identify Davis, and the courts ultimately found him responsible. But one part of the story could never be resolved. What might have happened if the deputies who encountered Davis that night had known that Polly had just been kidnapped? That question would remain unanswered, even after the verdict and the death sentence. The law could determine Davis's guilt. It could determine his punishment. It could establish the facts supported by evidence. But it could not rewrite that night in Petaluma, and it could not return Polly to the home from which she had been taken. The verdict in the Polly Klaas case answered one question, but it could never answer the questions that mattered most to Polly's family. On June 18, 1996, A jury found Richard Allen Davis guilty of the crimes connected to Polly's kidnapping and murder. The decision came nearly 3 years after the 12-year-old girl had been taken from her home in Petaluma. For the legal system, the verdict represented the conclusion of a long process of investigation, evidence gathering, and courtroom argument. For those who had searched for Polly, however, a guilty verdict could not undo the night of October 1st, 1993. It could not erase the weeks of uncertainty that followed. It could not change the discovery of Polly's body near Cloverdale. And it could not resolve the question that had haunted the case from its earliest hours. What might have happened if the information about Polly's kidnapping had reached the deputies who encountered Davis on that rural road? The answer would remain unknowable. The deputies had not known that a child had just disappeared. They had not known that Davis was connected to the crime. They had no established legal reason to hold him, and after examining the circumstances, they allowed him to leave. Their encounter with him, therefore, became one of the most painful elements of the entire case. It was not a simple story of officers knowingly releasing a kidnapping suspect. It was a failure of information at a critical moment. The deputies were operating with the knowledge available to them at the time, while the public would later judge that moment with the knowledge of everything that followed. That difference between what was known then and what became known later is one of the reasons the case continues to provoke difficult questions. According to Davis's later account, Polly was still alive when he was stopped. He claimed that he had hidden her in a wooded area near the place where his vehicle became stuck and that he returned for her after the deputies left. Because this information came from Davis, it cannot be treated as a complete and independently verified reconstruction of those moments. But his account placed an even darker significance on the police encounter. It meant that the man who had taken Polly had already crossed paths with law enforcement while the investigation was beginning. The opportunity had existed, but the necessary information had not. Nobody can say with certainty what would have happened if the deputies had known about the kidnapping. Perhaps Davis would have been detained. Perhaps investigators would have discovered the connection to Polly. Perhaps Polly could have been found, or perhaps events would still have unfolded differently. There is no evidence that can answer those possibilities with certainty. The only fact that remains is that Davis left the scene and the search continued. The case also forced California to confront another uncomfortable issue. Richard Allen Davis had not entered Polly's life as a person with no known history. He had already been involved in serious crimes. His record included theft, kidnapping, and violent offenses. In one previous case, he had kidnapped a woman near a BART station in Hayward. In 1985, he was convicted in San Mateo County for another kidnapping, in which the victim was forced to withdraw money from a bank. He received a 16-year sentence. By 1993, he had been released on parole. He had been free for approximately 3 months when Polly was kidnapped. The timing became one of the most controversial aspects of the case because it raised a question that extended beyond Davis himself. What should society do with people who have already demonstrated a capacity for serious violence? How should parole decisions balance rehabilitation, punishment, and public safety? And when someone with a substantial criminal history commits another terrible offense after release, how should responsibility be understood? Those questions existed before Polly's death, but her case brought them into the national spotlight with extraordinary force. Polly became more than the victim of a single criminal act in the public imagination. Her name became associated with a broader debate about repeat offenders and the consequences of releasing people with serious criminal histories. California's 3 strikes legislation, passed in 1994, became part of that conversation. The law sought to impose much harsher punishment on people who repeatedly committed serious offenses. The public response to Polly's murder helped create an atmosphere in which tougher measures against repeat offenders gained enormous support. The connection between Polly's case and 3 strikes became one of the most enduring parts of her legacy. Yet there is a danger in remembering Polly only through the laws and political debates that followed. Her death, When a victim becomes associated with legislation, statistics, or criminal justice policy, the individual person can disappear behind the historical consequences of the case. Polly was not a symbol before she became a victim. She was a 12-year-old girl living with her family in Petaluma. She was spending an evening with two friends. She was in her bedroom when a stranger entered the home. The tragedy began with the destruction of that ordinary sense of safety. Everything that followed, the search, the media attention, the investigation, the arrest, the trial, the verdict, the death sentence, and the political consequences came afterward. That distinction matters because the legal legacy of the case should not replace the human story at its center. The search for Polly had involved a community trying to find a child. Her photograph circulated because people hoped someone would recognize her and bring her home. Volunteers searched because they believed she might still be alive. Her family waited for information because uncertainty offered the possibility of hope while also creating unbearable fear. When Davis finally led investigators to Polly's remains, that uncertainty ended in the most devastating way possible. The discovery answered the question of where she was, but it also meant there would be no reunion. The later trial could establish responsibility, but it could not restore the life that had been lost. The death sentence imposed on Davis on September 26, 1996, therefore represented the final legal judgment in the case, but not a resolution for Polly's family in any emotional sense. A court can determine guilt. It can impose punishment. It can create a formal ending to criminal proceedings. But it cannot provide an equivalent for the loss of a child. The sentence also did not erase the circumstances that made the case so disturbing. Davis had entered a family home. He had taken a child. He had escaped immediate detection. He had been encountered by police and released. He had remained free while the search continued. Investigators eventually identified him through evidence and his own statements. And the case had demonstrated how quickly an ordinary family tragedy could become a national criminal justice issue. Looking back, the investigation can be understood as a chain of moments. The first was the kidnapping itself. The second was the discovery that Polly was missing. The third was the police encounter with Davis. The fourth was the long period of uncertainty. The fifth came when investigators returned to the rural area and discovered evidence that redirected their attention toward Davis. Then came his arrest, the palm print in Polly's bedroom, and finally his decision to lead investigators to her body. Each moment changed what investigators knew. The case did not reveal its answer all at once. It emerged gradually through pieces of information that had to be connected. The palm print was especially significant because it transformed Davis from a suspicious figure associated with the surrounding area into someone physically connected to the room where Polly had been taken. His later statement and the location of Polly's remains provided further confirmation of his involvement. The investigation therefore demonstrated both the limitations and the strengths of criminal investigation. Information can arrive too late. Leads can be missed. Suspects can remain unidentified. But physical evidence can survive uncertainty. And careful investigation can eventually connect seemingly separate events. In the end, Richard Allen Davis was convicted and sentenced to death. The legal system had reached its judgment. California had also begun moving toward a harsher approach to repeat offenders. But the most haunting element of the case remained outside the reach of any verdict. It was the brief encounter on the rural road when Davis and law enforcement crossed paths without understanding what that moment represented. The deputies did not know they were standing near the center of a kidnapping investigation. Davis knew. According to his later account, Polly was nearby. Then the officers left, and Davis continued on. Years of legal proceedings could establish what happened afterward. But they could never change that moment. And perhaps that is why the Polly Klaas case continues to endure in public memory. It is not simply because of the crime, the trial, or the sentence. It is because the case forces us to confront the uncomfortable distance between knowing something afterward and knowing it when it matters. On October 1st, 1993, that distance was measured in information that had not yet arrived. For Polly, the consequences were irreversible. For California, the case became part of a much larger debate about crime and punishment. And for everyone who followed the investigation, the story became a reminder that sometimes the most painful questions are the ones that evidence can never answer. The story of Polly Klaas is often remembered through its most recognizable moments. The 12-year-old girl taken from her home, the massive search that followed, the discovery of Richard Allen Davis, the palm print found in Polly's bedroom, the confession, and the death sentence. But between those moments was an investigation built from uncertainty. For weeks, investigators did not have a complete picture. They had to work backward from what was known and gradually determine which pieces belonged to the same story. That process is important because the case did not become clear simply because Davis was eventually identified. It became clear because investigators were able to connect separate facts that initially appeared unrelated. The first fact was the disappearance itself. On October 1st, 1993, Polly had been at home in Petaluma with two friends. Around 10 o'clock that night, Davis entered the house carrying a knife. He restrained the three girls and threatened them before taking Polly. He then left the home with her in a white Ford Pinto. The two remaining girls were eventually able to raise the alarm, and Polly's mother, Eve Nichols, contacted police. The response was immediate. Police began searching, the FBI became involved, and volunteers joined the effort. But the first stage of the investigation was defined by what authorities did not know. They did not know the identity of the person who had taken Polly. They did not know where he had gone. They did not know whether Polly was alive. And they did not know that Richard Allen Davis was already moving through the area. Those missing pieces of information would shape everything that followed. One of the most important investigative questions concerned the white Ford Pinto. Davis had driven away from Petaluma with Polly, eventually reaching a rural location about 20 miles away. There, his vehicle became stuck on a private road. A landowner noticed him and contacted law enforcement. Two Sonoma County Sheriff's deputies arrived. They questioned Davis and examined the vehicle. Yet, because information about Polly's kidnapping had not reached them, they did not understand the significance of what they were seeing. They found no legal basis to hold him and eventually helped get his vehicle free. Davis left. That encounter would later become a central part of the story because investigators would realize that the man they were searching for had been within their reach shortly after the kidnapping. But at the time, the connection did not exist. This is one of the difficulties of reconstructing an investigation from hindsight. Once the suspect's identity is known, earlier events can appear obvious. The white Ford Pinto becomes important. The rural road becomes important. Davis's suspicious behavior becomes important. But none of those facts automatically revealed the entire crime to the deputies at that moment. They were operating without the information that investigators would later acquire. The investigation therefore continued. Polly's photograph circulated widely. Police, FBI personnel, volunteers, and members of the public searched for her. The effort extended into rural areas and other locations where investigators believed information might lead them. Yet no immediate breakthrough brought Polly home. Davis remained outside the center of the investigation. He had a criminal history, but that history alone did not identify him as Polly's kidnapper. He had previously been convicted of serious crimes, including kidnapping and violent offenses. In 1985, he had been convicted in San Mateo County after a kidnapping in which the victim was forced to withdraw money from a bank. He had received a 16-year sentence. Another earlier case involved the kidnapping of a woman near Bard in Hayward. By 1993, Davis had been released on parole. He had been out of prison for approximately 3 months when Polly disappeared. These facts would later become deeply significant, but during the early stages of the investigation, they did not provide the answer by themselves. A criminal record can establish a person's past. It does not, by itself, establish responsibility for a new crime. Investigators needed evidence connecting Davis specifically to Polly. That evidence began to emerge in late November. On November 28th, a landowner returned to the area where Davis's vehicle had previously been found stuck. A sweatshirt was discovered. Inside were items that attracted investigative attention, including tape. The significance of the discovery came from its location and its connection to the earlier encounter with Davis. Investigators began looking again at the man who had been in that area shortly after Polly disappeared. The question was no longer simply whether Davis had a criminal past. The question became whether his presence at that location was connected to Polly. His history made him worth examining more closely, but the investigators still needed something stronger. On November 30th, Davis was arrested near Coyote Valley Indian Rancheria, close to Ukiah. At first, he denied involvement in Polly's disappearance. That denial meant the investigation still depended on evidence capable of establishing the connection without relying on Davis's cooperation. 2 days later, that evidence arrived in the form of a palm print. Investigators had examined Polly's bedroom, the place where the kidnapping began. A palm print was found there. On December 2nd, the print was identified as belonging to Richard Allen Davis. The importance of that evidence cannot be overstated. Davis could deny involvement, but the physical evidence placed him inside Polly's bedroom. The room was not merely somewhere in Petaluma. It was the location where Polly had been taken from her friends and removed from her home. The palm print established a direct physical connection between Davis and the scene. The investigation now had multiple strands that could be brought together. Davis had been near the area shortly after the kidnapping. His vehicle had become stuck there. Evidence had been discovered at that location. His criminal history provided context, and, most importantly, his palm print had been found inside Polly's bedroom. The case was moving toward a point where investigators could ask Davis not merely whether he knew anything about Polly, but what he had done. On December 4th, Davis asked to speak with investigators. According to the case record, he told them, "I fucked up big time." He then admitted that Polly was dead and agreed to lead investigators to her remains. This was the moment when the investigation gained the information it had been missing for almost 2 months. Davis's statement did not simply confirm that Polly had died. He also knew where she had been left. He directed investigators toward an area near Cloverdale, outside Petaluma, along the US 101 area. There, Polly's body was found in brush. For investigators, the discovery provided a devastating answer to the question that had driven the search since October 1st. For Polly's family, it ended the uncertainty that had lasted for weeks, but not in the way anyone had hoped. The search for a missing child had become the recovery of a murdered child. Davis's subsequent account also provided investigators with his version of what happened after the kidnapping. He claimed that Polly had been hidden near the rural area where his vehicle became stuck, and that she was still alive when the deputies encountered him. He said that after the deputies left, he returned for her and drove north. He later claimed that he strangled Polly because he feared returning to prison. He also said that alcohol and drugs had affected him at the time. These statements became part of the case, but they had to be distinguished from independently established evidence. Davis was the person responsible for the crime, and his account provided information, but his version of events could not automatically answer every question about Polly's final hours. Investigators and prosecutors, therefore, had to rely on the broader body of evidence. The physical evidence in Polly's bedroom was particularly important. The palm print did not depend on Davis admitting that he had been there. It provided a separate connection. His knowledge of the location where Polly's body was found was another important element because he personally led investigators there. The circumstances surrounding his vehicle also connected him to the period immediately after the kidnapping. Together, these facts transformed the case from a disappearance with an unknown offender into a homicide case centered on a specific defendant. But there was another dimension to the investigation that would become important later. preparation. Prosecutors argued that Davis had not simply stumbled into a situation that unexpectedly escalated. According to the supplied case information, evidence showed that he had brought materials used to restrain the girls. That evidence became part of the prosecution's argument about the nature of the crime. It suggested that the confrontation inside Polly's bedroom involved actions that were prepared in advance rather than being entirely spontaneous. This distinction mattered because the charges Davis faced were serious, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, burglary, robbery, and a sexual offense involving a child. The prosecution would ultimately have to establish the legal elements of those charges in court. The investigation had provided the foundation. The arrest had provided the defendant. The evidence had provided the connection. And the confession had provided information that led investigators to Polly. The next stage would require those pieces to be placed before a jury. By then, the case had already become larger than a single investigation. Polly's name had become known throughout the country. Her disappearance had drawn enormous public attention. Her death had intensified debate over repeat offenders and parole. But before the case could become a political symbol or a legal precedent, it had been an investigation into one missing 12-year-old girl. The investigators' task had been to find her, determine what happened, and identify the person responsible. They had eventually accomplished those objectives, but only after weeks of uncertainty and a chain of evidence that slowly brought Davis into focus. The most painful irony remained the same one that had existed from the beginning. The suspect had crossed paths with police shortly after Polly was taken. The officers had not known what they were looking at. The information necessary to connect Davis to the kidnapping was not yet available to them. Later, the palm print, the evidence near the rural road, Davis's arrest, and his confession would create the connection that had been missing that night. By December 1993, there was no longer a mystery about who had taken Polly. There was a defendant, physical evidence, a confession, and the location of Polly's remains. What remained was the question of legal responsibility and punishment. That question would be answered in a California courtroom in 1996. But even as the investigation moved toward trial, the case continued to carry the weight of the moment when information had arrived too late. It was a reminder that investigations are not conducted with perfect knowledge. They unfold one fact at a time. And sometimes, by the time all the facts are known, the opportunity to change what happened has already passed. By the time the case reached the courtroom in 1996, the central facts were no longer hidden. Richard Allen Davis had been identified, arrested, connected to Polly's bedroom through a palm print, and had ultimately led investigators to the place where Polly's body was found. But a criminal trial is not simply a retelling of what investigators believe happened. It is a process in which evidence must be presented, challenged, and measured against the legal standards required for conviction. For the prosecution, the task was to establish Davis's responsibility for the kidnapping and murder of Polly Klaas. For the defense, the task was to challenge aspects of the state's interpretation of the crime and, particularly, the allegations concerning Davis's motives. Nearly 3 years had passed since the night Polly disappeared. The distance between October 1993 and the courtroom in 1996 meant that the case had already become part of California's wider public consciousness. Polly's name was known far beyond Petaluma. Her disappearance had attracted enormous attention, and her death had become connected to debates about repeat offenders and parole. But inside the courtroom, the focus had to return to evidence. The prosecution's case began with the events inside the Klaas home. On October 1, 1993, Polly was 12 years old. She was having a sleepover with 2 friends. The girls were in Polly's bedroom when Davis entered the house carrying a knife. According to the supplied case information, he restrained the 3 girls and threatened them before taking Polly. He then left the house with her in a white Ford Pinto. Those circumstances established the beginning of the kidnapping and placed Davis at the center of the events that night. The prosecution also had evidence connecting him directly to the bedroom. A palm print had been discovered in Polly's room, and was identified as Davis's on December 2nd, 1993. That piece of evidence was particularly significant because it did not depend on Davis admitting that he had entered the home. It provided a physical connection between him and the precise location where Polly had been taken. The palm print was therefore part of the foundation of the prosecution's case. Another important element was what happened after Davis left the house. His white Ford Pinto eventually became stuck on a private road in a rural area roughly 20 miles from Petaluma. A landowner contacted authorities, and 2 Sonoma County Sheriff's deputies arrived. They questioned Davis and examined his vehicle, but they did not know about Polly's kidnapping. Without that information, they had no legal basis to keep him. They helped free the vehicle, and Davis left. By the time of the trial, that encounter had become one of the most haunting elements of the case. It demonstrated how close law enforcement had come to the person responsible without understanding the significance of the encounter. Yet the courtroom could not turn hindsight into evidence. The deputies had not knowingly released a kidnapping suspect. They had not known that a child was missing in circumstances connected to the man they were questioning. Their encounter, therefore, remained a tragic example of how incomplete information can affect an investigation. The prosecution also had Davis's later statements. After his arrest on November 30th, 1993, Davis initially denied involvement in Polly's disappearance. But on December 4th, he asked to speak with investigators. According to the case record, he said, "I fucked up big time." He then admitted that Polly was dead and agreed to lead investigators to her body. His information took investigators to an area near Cloverdale, outside Petaluma, along the US 101 area, where Polly was found in brush. His ability to lead investigators to Polly's remains became another important part of the evidence against him. The prosecution could point not only to the palm print in Polly's bedroom, but also to Davis's knowledge of where Polly had been left. His statement therefore became part of a larger evidentiary chain rather than standing alone. Davis's own description of the killing was also examined. He claimed that after returning for Polly from the area where she had initially been hidden, he drove north and eventually strangled her because he feared that the kidnapping would send him back to prison. He also claimed that alcohol and drugs had affected him. Those statements presented the prosecution with Davis's own explanation for the killing, but they did not determine the legal outcome by themselves. The prosecution argued that the circumstances involved preparation and intent. According to the supplied information, evidence showed that Davis had brought materials used to restrain the girls. That evidence was important because it challenged any portrayal of the kidnapping as something that had developed entirely by accident. The state sought to establish that Davis had entered the house, controlled the girls, removed Polly, and ultimately killed her. The defense took a different approach. Davis's lawyers did not completely deny that he had killed Polly. Instead, they challenged specific allegations, particularly the claim that the crime had involved a sexual motive. That distinction mattered because the trial was not simply about whether Davis was responsible for Polly's death. The jury also had to consider the individual charges and whether the evidence established the elements required for each one. The charges included first-degree murder, kidnapping, burglary, robbery, and a sexual offense involving a child. The prosecution, therefore, had to present a case broad enough to address each allegation. The defense, meanwhile, could focus on weaknesses or uncertainties in particular aspects of the state's argument. The jury had to weigh the evidence rather than simply respond to the enormous public emotion surrounding Polly's death. That was an especially important responsibility because the case had become deeply symbolic. Polly was a child. Her disappearance had captured national attention. The discovery of her body had generated grief and anger. Davis's criminal history had intensified public demands for accountability. Yet the legal system still required a verdict based on the evidence presented in court. Davis's history was extensive. He had prior convictions involving serious offenses, including kidnapping and violent crimes. In 1985, he had been convicted in San Mateo County in connection with a kidnapping in which the victim was forced to withdraw money from a bank. He had received a 16-year sentence. Another earlier case involved the kidnapping of a woman near Bart in Hayward. He was released on parole in 1993, approximately 3 months before Polly disappeared. That history was significant to the public because it raised questions about how someone with a serious record had returned to the community. But prior crimes could not by themselves prove that Davis had committed the specific offenses charged in the Polly Klaas case. The prosecution's stronger evidence came from the direct connection to Polly, the palm print, the circumstances surrounding the white Ford Pinto, the evidence found near the rural location, Davis's eventual statements, and his ability to lead investigators to Polly's remains. The pieces formed a narrative that connected the defendant to the crime from its beginning to its aftermath. By the time the jury considered the case, the defense could challenge particular interpretations, but Davis's connection to Polly was supported by multiple forms of evidence. On June 18, 1996, the jury returned its verdict. Richard Allen Davis was found guilty of the crimes brought against him in connection with Polly's kidnapping and murder. The verdict represented the formal conclusion of the guilt phase of the trial. For the prosecution, it meant that the evidence had satisfied the jury's legal standard. For the defense, the attempt to challenge the state's case had failed to prevent conviction. And for Polly's family, the verdict was a recognition of responsibility. But it could never be a restoration of what had been lost. The courtroom had reached a conclusion about Davis. It could not reach one about Polly's life beyond the crime. It could not return her to her family. It could not erase the memory of October 1st, 1993. It could not change the fact that she had been taken from a place where she should have been safe. And it could not answer the questions surrounding that rural police encounter. The verdict also brought the case closer to its final legal stage. A guilty verdict determines responsibility, but it does not necessarily determine the ultimate punishment until the penalty phase has concluded. In Davis's case, the question of punishment would become another major part of the proceedings. The prosecution would seek the harshest available penalty, while the defense would have an opportunity to argue against it. The jury's decision would have consequences not only for Davis, but also for the larger public debate that had grown around Polly's name. By 1996, the case had already helped fuel discussions about repeat offenders, parole, and California's approach to criminal sentencing. But before the political consequences could be fully understood, the court still had to decide what would happen to the man responsible for Polly's death. The next stage would therefore move beyond guilt and into punishment. The question would no longer be whether Richard Allen Davis had committed the crimes. The jury had answered that. The question would be whether his crimes justified the ultimate penalty under California law. On the other side of that question was the memory of a 12-year-old girl whose disappearance had begun with a sleepover in Petaluma and ended with a search for her body. The trial had established responsibility. The sentencing phase would determine the legal consequence. And as the proceedings moved toward their final decision, Polly's case was already becoming something larger than a single courtroom verdict. A case that would influence the way California thought about repeat offenders, punishment, and the consequences of releasing people with serious criminal histories. By the time the jury reached the sentencing phase of Richard Allen Davis's trial, the legal question of guilt had already been answered. On June 18, 1996, the jury found Davis guilty of the crimes connected to the kidnapping and murder of Polly Klaas. But a conviction was not the end of the case. The court still had to determine the punishment. For a crime that had begun with the abduction of a 12-year-old girl from her own bedroom and ended with her death, the question of punishment carried enormous weight. The prosecution sought the ultimate penalty available under California law. The defense had the opportunity to argue against it. And behind those legal arguments stood the memory of Polly herself, whose disappearance had already affected an entire community and contributed to a much broader debate about crime, parole, and repeat offenders. The penalty phase required the jury to consider the seriousness of what Davis had done and the circumstances surrounding the crime. By this point, the basic sequence was established. On October 1st, 1993, Davis entered the Kloss home carrying a knife. Polly and two friends were in the bedroom. Davis restrained the girls and threatened them before taking Polly from the house. He left in a white Ford Pinto and eventually became stranded on a rural private road roughly 20 miles from Petaluma. Two Sonoma County Sheriff's deputies encountered him there, but they did not know about the kidnapping. They questioned him, examined his vehicle, and ultimately helped him get the vehicle free. He left the area. Weeks later, investigators began to focus on him. Evidence discovered near the location where his vehicle had been stuck helped redirect the investigation. Davis was arrested on November 30th. His palm print was identified in Polly's bedroom on December 2nd. On December 4th, Davis asked to speak with investigators, acknowledged that Polly was dead, and led them to the place where her body had been left near Cloverdale. These facts had already been presented during the trial, but their significance remained central to the question of punishment. The prosecution could point to the circumstances of the kidnapping, the fact that Polly had been taken from her home, and the evidence indicating that Davis had prepared materials used to restrain the girls. According to the supplied case information, prosecutors argued that the crime was not simply an unpredictable act that developed without preparation. Davis had brought items that could be used to restrain the girls, and he entered the home carrying a knife. The prosecution's argument therefore portrayed the crime as a sequence of deliberate actions that began before Polly was taken from her bedroom and continued afterward. Davis himself had provided an explanation for the killing. According to his account, he eventually strangled Polly because he was afraid that the kidnapping would cause him to return to prison. He also claimed that he had been affected by alcohol and drugs at the time. Those statements did not excuse the crime. They instead became part of the evidence through which the circumstances of the killing were understood. His explanation also revealed one of the central themes of the case. Davis had acted to protect himself from the consequences of the kidnapping, even though that meant taking the life of the child he had abducted. The defense had not completely denied that Davis killed Polly. Instead, his lawyers concentrated on challenging particular accusations, especially the claim that the crime involved a sexual motive. That strategy was important because it showed that the defense was not necessarily attempting to construct an alternative explanation in which Davis had nothing to do with Polly's death. Instead, the lawyers sought to limit the legal interpretation of what he had done and to challenge specific allegations made by the prosecution. The jury had already rejected the defense's attempt to avoid conviction. Now the question was punishment. Davis's criminal history also became an important part of the broader context. He was not a first-time offender who had suddenly appeared in the criminal justice system. His record included theft, kidnapping, and violent offenses. In one earlier case, he had kidnapped a woman near a BART station in Hayward. In 1985, he had been convicted in San Mateo County in another kidnapping in which the victim was forced to withdraw money from a bank. He received a 16-year sentence. In 1993, he was released on parole approximately 3 months before Polly disappeared. The timing was impossible to ignore. The man responsible for Polly's kidnapping had been released from prison only months earlier after serving a sentence for a serious kidnapping offense. That fact would become one of the most powerful elements in the public discussion surrounding the case. The question was no longer simply what one man had done. It became a question about whether the criminal justice system had adequately assessed the danger posed by a repeat offender. The Polly Kloss case became part of a political movement toward tougher sentencing in California. In 1994, California adopted its 3 strikes law, which sought harsher punishment for repeat offenders who committed serious crimes. The case of Polly Kloss became closely associated with the movement behind such measures. Her name was invoked in discussions about public safety and the consequences of allowing people with serious criminal histories to return to society. The relationship between Polly's murder and California's three strikes policy became one of the most enduring aspects of the case. But the legal proceedings involving Davis remained focused on his individual responsibility. The jury was not simply deciding how society should respond to repeat offenders in general. It was deciding what punishment Richard Allen Davis should receive for the crimes he had committed against Polly Klaas. On September 26, 1996, Judge Thomas Hastings formally sentenced Davis to death. The sentence represented the final judgment of the trial court in the case. Davis had been convicted, and now the court had imposed the ultimate punishment. For the legal system, this brought the trial to its formal conclusion. But for Polly's family, no sentence could produce a true ending. A death sentence could punish the person responsible, but it could not restore the life of a 12-year-old girl. It could not return Polly to her mother, her sister, or the friends who had been with her that night. It could not erase the weeks of searching or the moment when investigators discovered that the missing child would never come home. The sentence also could not eliminate the most disturbing, unresolved question in the case. What might have happened during the encounter between Davis and the sheriff's deputies on the rural road? According to Davis's later account, Polly was still alive when the deputies encountered him. He claimed that he had hidden her nearby and returned for her after the officers left. If that account was accurate, then the police encounter occurred during a period when Polly had not yet been killed. But because this information came from Davis, it must be treated as his account rather than as an independently established timeline of every moment. There is no way to know with certainty whether a different police response would have saved Polly. The officers did not have the information necessary to connect Davis to the kidnapping. They were responding to a report about a stranded vehicle and a suspicious man, not to a known kidnapping suspect. Their decision to release him was made within that limited context. Hindsight changes how the event looks, but it does not change what the deputies knew at the time. That distinction is important because the tragedy of the case does not require turning the police encounter into a simple story of individual blame. The deeper tragedy is that two separate pieces of information existed at the same time but never met. Polly had been kidnapped. Davis was nearby. The deputies knew only one of those facts. Investigators searching for Polly knew the other. The connection came later, after an opportunity had already passed. The case, therefore, became a powerful example of how an investigation can depend on the speed and completeness with which information travels between people and agencies. It also demonstrated the importance of physical evidence when initial information is incomplete. The palm print in Polly's bedroom eventually connected Davis to the scene. The evidence discovered near the rural location redirected investigators toward him. His arrest brought him into custody. His later statement led investigators to Polly's remains. Each development closed another part of the gap created during those first hours. By the time Davis received his death sentence, the legal system had reconstructed enough of the case to establish responsibility beyond the required standard. Yet the emotional consequences could not be measured in a verdict or a sentence. Polly's death had changed her family permanently. It had changed Petaluma. It had changed the public conversation about dangerous repeat offenders in California. And it had created a lasting association between the name Polly Klaas and the debate over three strikes. The case also illustrated the limits of punishment. Even the harshest sentence could not answer every question left behind. It could not explain why the crime happened in every detail. It could not establish what Polly experienced during every moment after she was taken. And it could not tell us whether the outcome could have been different during that brief encounter on the rural road. Those questions would remain beyond the reach of the courtroom. What the court could establish was that Richard Allen Davis was responsible for Polly's kidnapping and murder, and that the appropriate legal punishment, in the judgment of the jury and the court, was death. The sentence brought the formal trial to an end, but the story of Polly Klaas did not end there. Her case would continue to influence California's criminal justice debate, particularly discussions about repeat offenders and parole. Her name would remain connected to the three strikes law, and to the public demand for greater protection against people with histories of serious violence. Yet perhaps the most important way to remember the case is to resist allowing those broader consequences to overshadow the person at its center. Polly was 12 years old. She was at home with friends. She was taken from her bedroom. The investigation eventually found the person responsible, but it could not undo what had happened. The death sentence was a legal conclusion, not a restoration. And when the courtroom finally closed on the case, one question remained suspended over the entire story. If the deputies had known that night what investigators would only discover weeks later, could Polly have been saved? There is no evidence capable of giving a certain answer. That uncertainty is part of what makes the case so difficult to forget. The death sentence imposed on Richard Allen Davis on September 26, 1996, brought the formal trial of the Polly Klaas case to a close, but it did not bring an end to the consequences of what had happened. The murder of a 12-year-old girl had already reached far beyond the boundaries of Petaluma. It had become a case about the vulnerability of children, the dangers posed by repeat offenders, the responsibilities of the criminal justice system, and the painful consequences of information arriving too late. Yet beneath all of those larger questions was still the same individual story. Polly Hannah Klaas had been taken from her home on October 1, 1993. Nearly 2 months later, she was found dead. Richard Allen Davis was convicted of the crimes connected to her kidnapping and murder and sentenced to death. The legal system had reached its conclusion, but the loss itself could not be concluded. For Polly's family, there could be no verdict capable of restoring what had been taken. The trial could establish responsibility, but it could not return Polly to the life she had been living before that night. She had been 12 years old, surrounded by people she knew, in a home where she should have been safe. Her disappearance transformed an ordinary family evening into a national tragedy. The circumstances of the kidnapping were especially disturbing because Davis entered the home while Polly was with 2 friends. He carried a knife, restrained the girls, and threatened them before taking Polly away. The fact that the crime occurred inside the family home added another dimension to the fear surrounding the case. A home is generally understood as a place of protection, but on that night, the person who entered it became the source of the danger. Polly was removed from that environment and taken away in Davis's white Ford Pinto. From that moment, the investigation became a race against uncertainty. Police and FBI agents became involved. Volunteers and members of the public joined the search. Polly's photograph appeared in the media. People looked across Petaluma and surrounding areas for a child whose whereabouts were unknown. Every day, without an answer, extended the uncertainty for her family. The investigation eventually became one of the largest and most closely followed searches associated with a child disappearance in California during that period. But the case also demonstrated how difficult it can be to recognize the significance of an event while it is happening. The most haunting example was the encounter between Davis and 2 Sonoma County Sheriff's deputies. Shortly after the kidnapping, Davis's vehicle had become stuck on a private road in a rural area about 20 miles from Petaluma. A landowner contacted authorities. The deputies arrived, questioned Davis, examined his vehicle, and found no legal basis to keep him. They helped him get the vehicle free, and he left. What they did not know was that a 12-year-old girl had just been kidnapped. They did not know that Davis was connected to that crime. They did not know that the white Ford Pinto in front of them could be part of the investigation that was already beginning elsewhere. In retrospect, that encounter appears almost impossible to separate from the rest of the case. But it is important not to confuse hindsight with knowledge. The deputies were not knowingly releasing a kidnapping suspect. They were acting on the information available to them. The significance of the encounter emerged only later, after investigators had identified Davis and established his connection to Polly. According to Davis's later account, Polly was still alive when the deputies encountered him. He claimed that he had hidden her in a wooded area nearby and returned for her after the deputies left. That statement became one of the most painful elements of the case. but it must remain within its proper evidentiary context. It was Davis's account of what happened. It does not independently establish every detail of Polly's condition or precisely how long she remained alive. What it does establish is that Davis himself described the police encounter as occurring before he ultimately killed Polly. The possibility created by that account is impossible to ignore, even though nobody can know whether a different response would actually have changed the outcome. This uncertainty is perhaps more painful than a question with a definite answer. If the evidence showed exactly what would have happened, the case could be understood differently. Instead, there is only the possibility. Perhaps Davis could have been detained. Perhaps Polly could have been found. Perhaps the circumstances would still have prevented a rescue. No one can know. The investigation eventually found the evidence necessary to identify Davis. On November 28th, a landowner returned to the rural location where Davis had previously been encountered and found a sweatshirt containing items that drew investigators' attention, including tape. Investigators began reconsidering Davis's presence there. His criminal history made the discovery even more significant. He had previously been convicted of serious crimes, including kidnapping and violent offenses. He had been convicted in a 1985 San Mateo County kidnapping in which the victim was forced to withdraw money from a bank, and he had received a 16-year sentence. He had also been involved in an earlier kidnapping near a BART station in Hayward. Davis had been released on parole in 1993, only about 3 months before Polly disappeared. The fact that someone with this history had been released so shortly before another kidnapping and murder became a major source of public anger and political discussion. Davis was arrested on November 30th near Coyote Valley Indian Rancheria close to Ukiah. At first, he denied involvement, but the investigation was no longer dependent on his word. On December 2nd, forensic examination established that a palm print found in Polly's bedroom belonged to Davis. That evidence placed him inside the room where the kidnapping began. 2 days later, Davis asked to speak with investigators. According to the case record, he said, "I fucked up big time." He then acknowledged that Polly was dead and agreed to lead investigators to her body. He directed them to an area near Cloverdale, outside Petaluma, along the US 101 area. Polly was found in brush. After nearly 2 months, the search was over. But the conclusion of the search marked the beginning of another kind of public reckoning. California had to confront the question of how repeat offenders should be treated. Polly's case became closely associated with the political movement that produced the 3 strikes law in 1994. The law was intended to impose harsher penalties on people who repeatedly committed serious offenses. The relationship between Polly's murder and the 3 strikes debate became an important part of her legacy. Her name became associated with a policy response to the problem of repeat serious offenders. But that legacy is complicated. A law can change sentencing policy, but it cannot explain why one person committed a particular crime. It cannot erase the suffering of a family. And it cannot transform a tragedy into something that did not happen. The most meaningful way to understand the legacy of Polly Klaas may therefore be to recognize both dimensions of the case. One dimension is legal and political. Her death contributed to a major debate about California's criminal justice system and helped fuel support for harsher treatment of repeat offenders. The other dimension is human. She was a child whose life was taken from her. The second should never disappear beneath the first. Richard Allen Davis's criminal history also raises a difficult distinction between prevention and punishment. After a crime occurs, the legal system can investigate, prosecute, convict, and sentence the offender. Prevention is different. Prevention requires decisions to be made before the outcome is known. In Davis's case, questions about his parole became controversial precisely because the consequences were known only afterward. Before October 1st, 1993, the system had to decide what to do with a person who had already committed serious crimes. After October 1st, the consequences of that decision became tragically clear. The case therefore became part of a larger discussion about whether existing measures were sufficient to protect the public from repeat offenders. Yet even that discussion could not provide a simple explanation. No law can guarantee that every future violent crime will be prevented. No parole system can predict every action a person will take. What the case did demonstrate was the profound human cost that can result when the risks associated with a repeat offender are underestimated, or when critical information fails to connect at the moment it is needed. And that returns the story to the rural road where Davis was encountered shortly after Polly's kidnapping. The deputies had no idea they were looking at the man responsible for a crime that would soon dominate the attention of the nation. They did not know that Polly was nearby. They did not know that the investigation was already unfolding. They helped Davis free his vehicle, and then he left. Later, the palm print, the physical evidence, the arrest, and Davis's confession would establish what the deputies could not have known that night. The investigation ultimately worked. The person responsible was identified. Polly was found. Davis was convicted. He received the death penalty. But the success of the later investigation cannot erase the failure of timing at the beginning. That is what makes the case so haunting. The investigation demonstrates that justice can eventually uncover the truth, while also showing that truth discovered later is not always capable of repairing the consequences of what happened earlier. Polly's story, therefore, remains more than a record of a kidnapping and murder. It is also a story about time, the time before anyone knew she was missing, the brief period when Davis crossed paths with police, the weeks of searching, the moment investigators identified his palm print, and the day he finally led them to Polly. Each stage brought more information, but none could reverse the passage of time. The final legal judgment could establish responsibility, and the three strikes law could become part of California's response to repeat offenders. But neither could give Polly back her childhood or her future. In the years that followed, the case would continue to be remembered because of the questions it left behind. What happened inside the Kloss home? How did investigators eventually identify Davis? What role did his criminal history play in the public response? And above all, what might have happened if the deputies had known, during that brief encounter, what the rest of the investigation would eventually reveal? There is no definitive answer to that final question. Perhaps that is the most difficult truth of the entire case. Some mysteries are solved by evidence. Some questions remain forever beyond evidence. Polly's murder was solved. Richard Allen Davis was identified and convicted. But the possibility that one earlier moment might have changed everything remains unknowable. What can be known is simpler and more important. Polly Kloss was 12 years old. She was taken from her home. Her family endured weeks of uncertainty, and her death changed the lives of people far beyond the place where the crime occurred. Her name became connected to a major chapter in California's criminal justice history. But before she became a symbol, she was a child. Remembering that distinction is perhaps the most important way to remember her. The story of Polly Kloss does not end with the death sentence imposed on Richard Allen Davis. In a legal sense, September 26, 1996, marked the conclusion of the trial when Judge Thomas Hastings formally sentenced Davis to death. The jury had already found him guilty on June 18th. The investigation had established his connection to the crime through physical evidence, his movements after the kidnapping, and his own statements. Polly had been found after nearly 2 months of searching. The legal system had identified the person responsible and imposed its harshest punishment. Yet the deeper story remained unfinished, because no courtroom could restore the life that had been taken. Polly was 12 years old when she disappeared from her home in Petaluma on October 1, 1993. She had been spending the evening with 2 friends. Nothing about the beginning of that night suggested that it would become a case remembered across the United States. But shortly after 10 o'clock, Richard Allen Davis entered the home carrying a knife. He confronted the 3 girls, restrained them, and threatened them. Then he took Polly away. In a matter of moments, the safety of the home was destroyed, and a family entered a nightmare that would last for weeks. The two friends survived the encounter and raised the alarm. Polly's mother, Eve Nichols, contacted police, and the search began. Police, the FBI, volunteers, and members of the public became involved. Polly's photograph was circulated widely. People searched because there was still a possibility that she could be found alive. That possibility became the emotional center of the investigation. Every day, without an answer, extended the uncertainty. Every lead carried the possibility of hope. And every unsuccessful search made the eventual outcome more painful. The case would later become famous for the evidence that eventually identified Davis. But one of its most haunting details occurred almost immediately after the kidnapping. Davis drove away in his white Ford Pinto and eventually reached a rural private road roughly 20 miles from Petaluma. His vehicle became stuck. A landowner saw him and contacted law enforcement. Two Sonoma County Sheriff's deputies arrived. They questioned Davis and examined the vehicle. They found no legal basis to hold him. And because information about Polly's kidnapping had not reached them, they did not know that the man in front of them could be connected to a missing child. They helped free his vehicle. Davis then left. Looking back, that encounter became one of the central tragedies of the case. The officers had encountered Davis shortly after the kidnapping, yet they did not know what had happened in Petaluma. They were missing the piece of information that could have transformed an otherwise ordinary, suspicious vehicle investigation into something much more serious. It is important, however, to distinguish between what investigators learned later and what the deputies knew at that moment. They did not knowingly release a kidnapping suspect. They were acting on the information available to them. The significance of the encounter emerged only after Davis was identified. According to Davis's later account, Polly was still alive when he was stopped. He claimed that he had hidden her near the rural location and returned for her after the deputies left. Because this information came from Davis, it must be treated as his account rather than as an independently established reconstruction of every moment of Polly's final hours. Still, it became one of the most disturbing elements of the case because it introduced the possibility that the brief police encounter had occurred before Polly's death. No one can establish with certainty what would have happened if the deputies had known about the kidnapping. That question cannot be solved by hindsight. It remains one of the unanswered possibilities surrounding the case. The investigation continued for almost 2 months. During that time, Davis was not immediately identified as the person responsible. His criminal history would eventually become crucial to understanding the public reaction, but investigators still needed evidence connecting him specifically to Polly. Davis had previously been convicted of serious crimes, including kidnapping and violent offenses. In 1985, he had been convicted in San Mateo County in a kidnapping in which the victim was forced to withdraw money from a bank. He received a 16-year sentence. Another previous case involved the kidnapping of a woman near a BART station in Hayward. Davis was released on parole in 1993, approximately 3 months before Polly disappeared. His release would later become a central issue in the public debate surrounding the case. But the investigation could not simply rely on his past. It needed evidence of what he had done to Polly. The breakthrough began on November 28th, when a landowner returned to the rural location where Davis's vehicle had previously been found stuck. A sweatshirt was discovered there. Inside were items that attracted investigators' attention, including tape. The discovery prompted investigators to reconsider Davis's presence in that area. His history made him especially significant, and the circumstances surrounding the location suggested that his earlier encounter with police might have been connected to the kidnapping. On November 30th, Davis was arrested near Coyote Valley Indian Rancheria close to Ukiah. Initially, he denied involvement in Polly's disappearance, but the investigation had already begun to move beyond his denials. Investigators examined the original crime scene again, and a palm print found in Polly's bedroom was identified as Davis's on December 2nd. The significance was direct. Davis had been inside the room where Polly was taken. His presence there could no longer be explained simply as a coincidence involving the surrounding area. The palm print provided physical evidence linking him to the beginning of the crime. 2 days later, on December 4th, Davis asked to speak with investigators. According to the case record, he said, "I fucked up big time." He then admitted that Polly was dead and agreed to lead investigators to her body. His information brought investigators to an area near Cloverdale, outside Petaluma, along the US 101 area. There, Polly was found in brush. After nearly 2 months, the search had reached its devastating conclusion. The family finally knew what had happened to Polly, but the answer was the one they had feared. She would not be coming home. Davis's statements also provided his account of Polly's death. He said that he had taken her from the place where she had initially been hidden, driven north, and eventually strangled her because he feared that the kidnapping would result in his return to prison. He also said that alcohol and drugs had affected him at the time. Those explanations did not remove his responsibility. Prosecutors argued that the crime involved preparation and that Davis had brought materials used to restrain the girls. The defense did not completely deny that Davis had killed Polly. Instead, it challenged specific allegations, particularly the accusation involving a sexual motive. The jury ultimately found Davis guilty on June 18, 1996. Then, on September 26, Judge Thomas Hastings sentenced him to death. The legal process had reached its final judgment, but the case's impact extended far beyond the courtroom. Polly's murder became closely associated with California's debate over repeat offenders and helped contribute to the political momentum behind the state's three-strikes law. Enacted in 1994, the law sought harsher punishment for people who repeatedly committed serious crimes. Davis's criminal history and his release on parole only months before Polly's kidnapping became central to the discussion. His case raised difficult questions about how society should respond to people who have already demonstrated a capacity for serious violence. Those questions remain larger than any single defendant. Yet the legacy of Polly Klaas should not be reduced to legislation. Laws, trials, and sentencing policies are consequences of the case, but they are not Polly herself. Before her name became associated with criminal justice reform, she was a 12-year-old girl living with her family in Petaluma. She was spending time with friends. She was in her bedroom. Her life was defined by ordinary experiences that should have continued for many years. The crime ended that future. That is why the human dimension of the case must remain at its center. The investigation may be remembered for the palm print, the white Ford Pinto, the rural police encounter, the sweatshirt, the confession, and the eventual discovery of Polly's body. The trial may be remembered for the guilty verdict and death sentence. California may remember the case as part of the history behind three strikes. But none of those facts should obscure the simplest truth. Polly was a child whose life was taken. The case also leaves a final lesson about the nature of criminal investigations. Truth does not always arrive at the moment when it is needed. On the night Polly disappeared, investigators did not know who had taken her. The deputies who encountered Davis did not know about the kidnapping. Weeks later, evidence began connecting Davis to the crime. The palm print provided a physical link. His arrest brought him into custody. His statement led investigators to Polly. Piece by piece, the uncertainty disappeared. But by the time the entire picture was visible, the opportunity to change the past had already gone. That is perhaps the most haunting element of the Polly Klaas case. It is not simply that a terrible crime occurred. It is that, for a brief period, the person responsible was already within the reach of law enforcement, while the crucial information remained elsewhere. Whether anything could have been done differently will never be known. There is no evidence capable of giving a certain answer. What remains is the sequence of facts. Polly was taken, Davis was encountered, the search continued. Evidence emerged, Davis was arrested, Polly was found, and justice followed. The law eventually answered the question of responsibility. It could not answer the question of what might have been, and perhaps that is where the story should finally rest, not with the notoriety of Richard Allen Davis, but with the memory of Polly Klaas. a 12-year-old girl whose disappearance shook a community, whose death influenced a national conversation about crime and punishment, and whose case remains a reminder that behind every criminal case, every statute, every verdict, and every investigation is a human life. Polly's life was cut short, but her story continued to shape the people and institutions that came after her. Remembering that story means remembering both the failure and the persistence, the information that arrived too late, the investigators who continued searching, the evidence that eventually revealed the truth, and the family that had to live with the loss. The final legal judgment could punish the person responsible. It could never make the tragedy disappear. The unanswered question from that rural road would remain unanswered. But the facts that were established would endure. Richard Allen Davis was convicted and sentenced to death. Polly Klaas was found, and the case became a permanent part of American criminal justice history. Most importantly, at the center of that history was not the man who committed the crime, but the child whose life was taken from her.